Hi, everybody. Welcome to the American Library in Paris, to Evenings with an Author. We're sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. I'm Rachel Donadio, the new Curator of Cultural Programs here at the library. We are the largest English language lending library on the continent, on the European continent, and we have been in operation for more than 100 years. I am very excited this evening that we have Simon Kuper and Pamela Druckerman here to discuss Simon's book, Impossible City, Paris in the 21st Century. The conversation will run for about 45 minutes, after which we will open it up to questions from you in the audience. Simon Kuper is a Financial Times journalist who has lived in Paris since 2002. He is now a British-French dual citizen. His books include Soccernomics, co-written with Stefan Szymanski, Chums, How a Tiny Caste of Oxford Tories Took Over the UK, and published in 2024, Impossible City, Paris in the 21st Century. Pamela Druckerman is a journalist and the author of 5 books, including Bringing Up Bébé, which has been translated into 31 languages. She won an Emmy for The Forger, a New York Times documentary about a French teenager in World War II. Her op-eds, essays, articles, and reviews have been published in the New York Times, The Economist, The Atlantic, Le Monde, and many other publications. Please help me welcome them with a big round of applause.
What Rachel very discreetly and politely didn't say is that we're also married. We just celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, though I can assure you there was no collusion for this interview. He has not seen any of the questions ahead of time, so there is no political corruption there.
I thought you'd hit it off when we brought you together here tonight.
We were bickering. I also thought this was be a good occasion to ask you all the personal questions that you never answer at home. But I thought I would start with what I'm sure a lot of people in this audience have gotten as a question, at least once a week since they've been in Paris. It's the classic expat in Paris or Anglophone in Paris question, which is, why are you here? And I feel like, I've answered it 1,000 times. I'm never happy with my answer. And I was thinking about it today and I realized the question has a tinge of like, what are you doing here? And it also has a tinge of like, how long do you plan to stay? Like you're some kind of lingering house guest? Oh. Yeah.
Sorry, long holiday.
But I thought maybe I would ask you with, in a kind-hearted way, what brought you to Paris?
Cheap real estate. So my cousin Richard, who you know, said to me in June 2001 that he had bought his apartment in Paris, his pied-à-terre, for £30,000. And I said, this is ludicrous, you're lying. And he said, no, for real. He said, but now it's much more. And I said, what, like £60,000? He said, yeah, definitely £60,000. So I was in my early 30s in London. I could not afford to buy anything in London, beyond some terrible distant place where you would never get to the centre of town. So 3 days later, I was on the Eurostar and I did buy an apartment for £60,000. It's not possible to do that now, but that was why. I never planned to live here. I had bad school French. I did not particularly like Paris, and it was just an investment.
You once told me, well, look, when they delivered the cheese plate at a restaurant, you said, I live here for the cheese. This is why I live in Paris. And I thought, oh God, so I guess.
Well, we were talking years later with Canadian friends of ours, you'll remember Toby and Nicole, about why we live. Would we stay in Paris? Because often for us and for them and for many people here, coming here is not a necessity. It wasn't your job that made you come here. It wasn't because you have family you have to look after. Coming to Paris is very often a choice, as it was for us. And we were having the conversation, would we stay here if the food wasn't so absolutely fantastic? And in my case, certainly, no, that's been a huge reason for staying. I
reread the book over the last few days.
Had you read it before?
I said reread, darling. And I would say I discovered it all over again. There were things I'd forgotten were in there. Things about me that I had forgotten were in there. But you talk a lot about the character of the plouk, the sort of country bumpkin. Guillemot's looking at me like she doesn't know what this is. The country bumpkin who arrives in Paris and has to learn the Parisian codes. And you sort of set yourself up in the book as the plouk, who learns the codes.
So a plouk is a French provincial in Paris slang, I think mostly. I guess you could use the phrase plouk in Bordeaux or Lyon, but I know it as a Parisian word which describes there's other words, con, like in dîner des cons, or bœuf. But the ignorant provincial who doesn't know how to speak or dress or behave. And so I've always felt like that in Paris, rightly so, as many of you will have as well, that you're always screwing up, you're always doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing or using the wrong accents. And I thought it was just me. And then I realized it's almost everyone in Paris. Either you think they're Parisians, but almost all of us are faking it. So it's a city of charlatans. It's a city of people like us who came from other countries. It's a city of people who secretly know that they are plouk, who came from the French countryside. It's people who came from the banlieues. It's people who came from provincial towns. It's people who came from former colonies. And there's this enormous attempt that I think many of us are making every day to learn the etiquette of this city, which is a much more developed and demanding etiquette than in comparable cities, New York and London, where in London, I've just come back from there is much greater freedom to dress and behave and speak however you want to. And in Paris, that has historically not been the case. I think in recent years, as it's got ever more international, it's loosening up a little. So yeah, we're all plouk under the skin. Almost everyone. There are a few genuine Parisian bourgeois who come from generations of Parisian bourgeois who do not feel that.
Yeah. You say that one of the first things you learned about the Parisian code is you're not allowed to say there's a code. So it's no, but don't talk about Fight Club.
I think that's true of most European etiquette codes, which are very specific, which you might have among the bourgeoisie of, say, Stockholm or Florence. And often they don't even know there is a code if you're really in it, because it's everything you always grew up with. It's how your parents talked, how your school friends talked. So it just came to you naturally. And it's meant to happen without work. Like most things in Paris are meant to seem effortless without work. In that sense, not so different from British upper class modes and codes. So I think the fact of mastering a code is you don't even remember there is a code. And for some people, that happens from the age of 1.
But you say in the book that the plouk might ask the hostess what the dress code is for the dinner party. And that would be the ultimate
so you're not allowed to ask rules. And in fact, I learned a lot of rules of dining from reading Guillemot's book, what's it called? Dîner en ville, which is a very rare, valuable attempt to explain codes of how you're supposed to act at dinners, but nobody will tell you. Because if you ask what is the dress code, it shows that you're a plouk. Whereas in New York, there's a much greater understanding that New York is a city of people who come from lots of different places. There's not a dominant sort of culture of people who were born in New York who are of higher status. There's a little bit of that, but much less than here. So in New York, it's fine to ask, we're all coming from different origins. How should I do this? How should we do this? It's much more acceptable anyway than here.
I thought you might be able to tell the story of Benjamin and Franklin, since we're talking about food, and John Adams both arriving in Paris right after the American Revolution to try to drum up support for America in France, and what they did. Yeah,
so Benjamin Franklin was known as, a hard worker, early to bed and early to rise. What was his phrase?
Yes.
He was a workaholic in the US, but he comes to Paris and he understands, which I came to belatedly understand, much of the business of the city is transacted over food and drink and has to be transacted over food and drink. So lunch and dinner are really important moments in Parisian working life as well. And a French lawyer once told me, at the law firm, if somebody asks you for lunch, always go, because that's where you'll get the most valuable information, most valuable insights. It's not like New York or London where the really successful people are eating a sandwich in front of their laptop. So Franklin comes here, and John Adams writes these letters complaining, we're trying to drum up French support for our new country, and Franklin's always out to dinner, he's out to tea with ladies, and I never see him around. It's hard even to get him to sign documents. And John Adams is thinking, I'm doing the American thing. I'm working day and night. I'm working my ass off. Franklin's a layabout. But I think Franklin probably penetrated much more successfully into the circles that matter in Paris. And why is that? I think it's partly because food and drink, this is the country in the world with the most developed food and drink culture and admiration. Maybe Japan is similar, going back centuries, but also it's a low trust society. So the way sociologists measure the trust of a country, it's this question they've been asking for decades. In general, do you think most people can be trusted? So in Scandinavian countries, people say, yeah, I think most people can be trusted. You get figures like 60, 70% saying that. In France, it's very low. It's much lower than in the UK or even the US. So it's something like 30% of people say. Right. So French people, of course, one immediately comes into generalizations, not true of everyone, but on average, French people are more likely to believe someone I don't know I can't do business with. Yeah. And so I have to get to know them if I don't already. So I prefer to do business with people I've known since I was 14. That's the ideal. Or people I met at a Grande École. That's how the country is run. But if I absolutely have to do business with someone I haven't met, then we need to eat together. And, I grew up in the Netherlands, so I have a lot of contacts in Holland. In Holland, if you want to do business with someone you've never met, you just call them, say, how about we do this? And the other person says yes or no, or maybe let's have coffee and talk. But you really don't have to go through this elaborate, complicated trust-building exercise.
But there's so much talk in France of your entourage and cultivating your entourage and building it. Those are really the people you trust.
Or your cadre, the people you've known forever. And that's also, I think, why the elite is so heavily constructed. Of course, there are US and UK analogies to this, I know. But why the elites are so heavily constructed around people you know from your Grande École, who you then hire to run the country with you. Mm. Yeah.
So speaking of Grandes Écoles and the elite entourages, Macron is a master of using the meal. I mean, using meals to sort of build his career. He built En Marche through one dinner at a time.
Yeah, I mean, it's in Guillemot's book. He never dined alone. Mm-hmm. So you look at Macron, if you imagine him, I mean, Macron in a way is a spiritual Londoner. And in 2013, he'd accepted a job as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and he was going to go to London. And, he's the kind of person you could see in London, doing really well, having a big career in some bank or international institution. And those people in London, they don't really go out much. But Macron, of course, he's also a plouc in his way because he comes from Amiens. And he came to Paris, il a monté à Paris, which is a very peculiarly French phrase, because it's the highest thing. You've risen, you've climbed the mountain to the highest thing. So il a monté à Paris, and he understood that to get ahead in Paris, you have to go and eat with people all the time. And Macron's particular genius is that he charms older people, especially older women, older men. And that is an incredibly useful gift if you want to rise quickly in an elite, because most people, they try and charm their circle. So then it takes another 30 years before you get real power. But he worked both.
So he met Hollande right before Hollande became president. You write that he immediately invited Hollande to dinner at his house.
Yeah, so he's met Hollande and he calls Hollande and he says, well, I'm having this dinner. And then he names the people who will be there. And he names them as a kind of sign of his bona fides, his power. I'm inviting powerful person X, Y, Z. And Hollande is kind of amused, this 30-year-old kid, he's showing me that he knows the whole elite. And of course, Hollande massively underestimates Macron. And Macron estimates Hollande correctly. Macron thinks this bumbling fool, at some point I'll stab him in the back. And Hollande thinks he sees me as a mentor.
Another one of the insights you had about France in the book is that, which I thought was very interesting, is that the French talk radical, but they act conservative. And the moment you had, at least the way you tell it in the book, that you had this insight was around vaccines. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the pandemic starts and there's about 10 months before there's a vaccine. And I'm thinking, when there is a vaccine, these people are not going to take it. Because there was this very big study by the Wellcome Trust in 2018, 148 countries about vaccine hesitancy or vaccine skepticism. Of the 148 countries, which country was number one in the Wellcome Trust analysis of vaccine skepticism? It was the French. I'm definitely not going to take any vaccine. They're just trying to kill you. Bill Gates is, it's all microchips in the brain stuff. So I thought, this is going to be a complete disaster because there's going to be a vaccine and we're still going to be stuck in a COVID nightmare and the rest of the world will be liberated. What happened, with some encouragement from Macron, who, made the pass obligatory to go to a restaurant, take a train and everything, very quickly, more than 90% of French people had 2 doses. And their vaccination rates were higher than the UK and Germany. And I realized these people were just faking it. They say, because what's the correct thing to say? I don't trust vaccines. I don't trust the government. I want a revolution. Those are the socially acceptable ways to talk. But it's not how people behave. I mean, this is also a country that for almost all the post-war history has elected a center-right leader. I think Mitterrand and Hollande were the only 2 exceptions. So, and it's a country where most of the protests, which have this radical language and barricades and burning garbage trucks and throwing things at the police, they're usually about conserving something. So you cannot change the pension, you cannot change the labor laws. That is what people will activate for. And so every president is elected on this kind of rhetoric of change, but as soon as the president tries to change anything, people stop him.
You also write that people who vote at the extremes, some of them want the extreme candidates to be elected, but often they don't want their candidate to win. They actually want a more conservative centrist candidate.
I mean, there's always this question with extreme parties, are they just protest votes? And I think in France, largely yes. So about half the country, close to half the country votes extreme left, so Mélenchon or another communist or a communist figure, or Le Pen, Zemmour. If you add that up, that's about half the country. And these are burn it down parties and candidates. And it's always been a safe thing to do because the way the French system works with 2 rounds is that the burn it down candidate never wins. But you can feel good about yourself. I voted for revolution. I voted for extreme change. But we got this anarch in a tailored suit and he's not going to change anything. And I've come to feel over time that a lot of the Le Pen Mélenchon voters, they want in the end the anarch in the tailored suit to win. That's the way it always works. That's what they expect. But your politics in France are often more a means of self-expression. I mean, it's an oddity of the US that the Americans will genuinely try, and half the country will genuinely try and elect a burn it down candidate. They genuinely are going for it. It's not just, Trump is not a protest vote. He's a real vote. So that seems to me rather different here. And you saw, the far right this summer got closer than it's ever been to a chance at power. And it seemed they might even get a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, but suddenly be the largest party. And they finished 3rd because I think when it comes to it, a lot of their voters think, oh, but I don't want her actually running the country.
Yeah, long may it last. Watching you work over the years, one of the things that's made a real impression on, I don't want to say impress me, but made an impression on me, is that you follow that kind of expat mantra, grow where you're planted. And by that, I mean that you look at what's in front of you. I mean, you mentioned that you grew up in the Netherlands and you've done a lot. It's a tiny country. It's not that geopolitically relevant, but you've managed to write quite a lot about it and to bring it into your life quite a lot. And the other thing that's happened with Paris changing so much, and especially the last sort of 15 years, is you've become an urbanist. That's become one of your areas of focus, and it's something that you cover a lot in the book in a really entertaining way. Could you talk about, because I think a lot of people don't realize about Grand Paris and what's happening with that. We have the kind of largest infrastructure project in all of Europe, and it's barely discussed.
It really strikes me, and I noticed when the international media was writing about Paris before the Olympics, you try and explain, and this is a major city, it's in the center of the world for the Olympics, and you speak to well-informed journalists from abroad, and they have no idea that this is a city or a metropolitan region that's building 68 new subway stations, all of them in the banlieue, several of which opened for the Olympics. This is, as you say, the biggest infrastructure project in Europe. Imagine that in London or New York. hey, we're going to build 68 new subway stations. We're also going to build a bunch of RER stations, bus stations, bike stations. We've laid several hundred kilometers of bike lanes in 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. So the problem of Paris was always the kind of original sin was the separation of the suburbs from the city. And you used to have a city wall, and then they built the périphérique. They completed this in 1973. And so you always know here whether you're in Paris or in the suburbs in a way that in London is much more diffuse. And so the gap is extreme. It reminds me, I say in the book, of the difference between sometimes the white Johannesburg, where my grandparents lived, and black Soweto, about 10 kilometers further. It's almost as extreme a divide. And it has never been bridged. They had one plan to do it, which was the report was completed in 1913, so then other matters prevented it happening. They then did another report on how to connect the suburbs with the city, the kind of Grand Paris idea, and it was published in June 1939, if I have this right. So again, it was not carried out. And Haussmann didn't care at all. Haussmann, who created our city, he didn't want the poor people in the city. And I think that's always been an idea which the elites have never been rude enough to say, but it's kind of handy that you have a wall, the périphérique, that stops the unwashed coming in. And so now they're actually going to do it. And we're living in the middle of this historical transformation of the city that's bigger than Haussmann, because finally it's now going to be easy, and is already, depending on where you live in which banlieue, much easier than before, to come in and out of the city to the degree that the walls of the city disappear. And
for the various banlieues to connect with each other without going through Paris.
Yeah. So most of these lines, I think almost all, you don't go. I mean, some stations, they take you into Paris, but they just take you to other banlieues. So you're going to get a city with multiple centers, whereas now it's a city with one center. So wherever you live in this 10 million metropolis or 12 million metropolis, you know that the center is, around Concorde. Yeah. And that's not going to be true in a few years' time, just as in London already, I've seen King's Cross become an alternative center of the city.
Yeah. And you mentioned 10 million metropolis, but that is the biggest metropolitan center in Europe right now.
In the European Union, yeah. I mean, it's, Istanbul and I think Moscow are bigger, yeah.
Right. You tell a story in the book about going with your friend Julien, our friend Julien, and going to visit the city in the banlieue where he grew up. Can you tell us about that and how cars were important for him, the way they're not in Paris? So
he says, look, I want to take you to the place where I'm from, and it's 20 kilometers drive, and you can only get there by car. And we get there, and he's very good at anthropology, kind of anthropology of his life. And so we arrive at the cafe that his mother used to run. And in front of the cafe, somebody has parked a 4x4 on the pavement right in front of the cafe. And Julien says, the guy's gone inside to show everyone in the cafe his 4x4, and they'll be talking about it. And so he said, in the banlieue, your car is who you are. In some ways, it's a bit like American life or German life as I've seen it, except that people live much smaller. And he said, I've moved up to the Marais, and it's taken me 20 years to make that move in my head. And he talked about, being a charlatan. He said, when I was first in the Marais, I'd go to our local cafe, and I wouldn't dare go in because I thought the people were too cool. And he says, now I sit in that cafe, and I wear the right clothes. And he says, I know that when I pass, other people see me and they think, that guy, he's too cool, I won't go in. So he talked about the process of being a Parisian, and he also talked about what he said is the kind of glass ceiling that banlieusards have in their heads, that you shouldn't want to rise, because rising is terrifying, because rising will bring you to Paris, and then you won't know how to cope, you won't know how to talk, and people will see that you're a banlieusard. So when we would take our boys together on Saturday mornings to football matches in the banlieue, we'd meet at the bakery, and he would buy a chouquette for everyone. And he would be wearing his tracksuit. And he said, this is my natural dress. This is how I grew up. And in Paris, I can only wear it when we're going to drive to the banlieue.
Speaking of getting to the banlieue, I wanted to talk about biking in Paris, because that's been another major change. Can you talk about the transformation? And are cars going to lose ultimately, or have they already lost?
Cars are losing and will continue to lose. I mean, the thing is, in Paris, it's not really a choice, because this is a 19th century city and it's just too small for cars. Once it becomes, in the 19th century when Haussmann was building it, well, there would have probably been less than 1 million people living in the whole area. No, maybe a couple of million. Now there's 10 million. If everybody drives their car, it's just not possible. And the thing is, Paris is perfectly suited to bikes. Paris itself without the banlieue, because you can cycle across it in 45 minutes. Most of it's flat. It works very well. The problem of Paris is always lack of space. That's also why people are so irritable, because you're always invading somebody's space. In the restaurant, in the office, and on the metro. And so how do we use this space? It's much more urgent. Like in Dallas, you can say, keep driving your cars. We built these big roads. There's a lot of space. We should also add a lane for bikes, but whatever. In Paris, it's just not an option. And so it is becoming and will become a cycling city. It takes people time to adapt mentally. It didn't for me, because I grew up on a bicycle in a small town in the Netherlands. For me, it's like, finally they've done something smart. They still don't know how to cycle. They still don't know how to drive. Parisians also should not have been allowed to drive because they can't. I'm also, the cyclists always astound me, because there's a very simple rule. If you're going right, you stick out your right hand. If you're going left, you stick out your left hand. That way you know where people are going. But just as cars here don't signal, nor do bicycles. So it's a lot of guesswork. They don't kill each other because everyone's going too slowly to kill each other. They would like to go fast enough to kill people, but they can't.
But the bikes now go faster than the cars. The city has recently found.
The average speed of a bike in Paris is slightly higher than a car. Yeah, it's also because we don't have to stop at red lights.
Well, I thought I would read, or you could read, a paragraph from, just one paragraph from your book that's about that, about your personal issues. Some days my ride this is on his bike, was so enervating that I'd lose control of my French and swear at rival road users in English. An effective tactic because they generally understood but couldn't immediately answer back. I'm going to start trying that. I found I had absorbed the uniquely Parisian mix of officiousness and rule breaking. One moment I'd be shouting self-righteously at a truck chilling on the bike path, and seconds later I'd run a red light. If I did stop at a red, cyclists racing up behind me would sometimes ring their bells in disgust. I loved the video on social media of a bicycling nun in Paris shooting through a red light.
Yeah, look it up. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Another thing that sort of landed in front of you in Paris was football, or I should say soccer, because I'm American and we're at the American Library. And that was partly through our children and them discovering football in Paris. Can you talk about that and how that led you out of Paris a bit?
Yeah, so when your kids join a football club, you see that all the fields are in the banlieue. And I think it's fair to say we had not spent much time in the banlieue prior to this moment. Like many Parisians, we had not seen a reason to cross the périphérique. And suddenly, every Saturday and sometimes Sunday morning, that was one bit of parenting that rightly was left to me. I would go with them.
I got everything else.
No, that's not completely true. We'll discuss this later. I would go with them to all these banlieues in the south and east of the city. And it was a very interesting education because it's football. It's a common language. It's a language I understand. It's a language everybody standing around the field understands. You can kind of read it and be accepted in a way. And I think for our sons, they've had this remarkable, it's about the only bit of Parisian life I've encountered that is integrated. I would say primary schools here are largely integrated. Then 1/3 of kids go to private collège. And of course, there's gaming of the collège and lycée system. Primary schools are genuinely quite integrated. And the only other bit that I've seen is football clubs. They're now integrating lycée somewhat, so there's a bit of that happening. And so the boys were telling me I think Ramadan was in the spring. So they're running laps around the field about 7 p.m. And the coach says, okay, the sun is set. Anyone who needs to go and break the fast can go. And a majority of the kids leave to break the fast. This is not how I grew up, so I'm very impressed by the functioning of Paris footballers and one of the very few integrated motors. And also it's become a field of Parisian excellence. So everyone knows that fashion, cuisine, luxury are fields of Parisian excellence. Football is now as well. I mean,
specifically the Paris suburbs.
Yeah, very largely the banlieue. So, if you think of people like Mbappe and Pogba and various people who play for African countries as well, they're Parisians who, parents from Senegal or Algeria. So there is no city in the world I've calculated that produces more football talent, which is remarkable.
And it's fairly new. I mean, what do you think? Yeah. Why do you think that happened?
Well, partly because most banlieues are new. So in 1984, France won the European Championship with a team containing 0 players from the Paris region. In 98, when they win the World Cup, there's about 3. Now they win the World Cup in 2018. I think the majority of players were from the Paris region. Mm-hmm. So what you've had, and that's also part of the transport issue, is this enormous growth since the war, especially as this previously agricultural country starts very belatedly urbanizing. And then you get a lot of immigration, first from North Africa, now more from sub-Saharan Africa. And so you just build and build and build suburbs, but without enough transport links. But you always build a complex sportif. So in every suburb, there is a well looked after artificial turf field, changing rooms, coaches with diplomas. It's a sign that there is a French state. When I've been to the poorest bits of Britain doing reporting, often you think there is no state, let alone in the US.
You quote the French footballer Paul Pogba saying, when you asked him that question, he said, because there's only football. That's why we play.
I think that probably was true in the age before the telephone. So, you know, what are you going to do? You live in a small apartment because it's a kind of Americanized life in terms of driving, but you have Parisian-style sized apartments in the banlieue. There's other kids living in the building, in the cité, so you go downstairs, and under Pogba's building where he grew up with his brothers, who both became professional footballers, and then famously one of them is now on trial for trying to extort money from Pogba with menaces, because if you get rich in a banlieue like that, you can have a problem with the people you grew up with. But so they would go downstairs to the sports little field at the bottom of their cité and they'd play football, and then they'd go to the local club because there is always a local club. And the quality is extremely high. When you get a culture of excellence, you know, whether it's basketball in a city, Chicago, or I don't know, making sushi in Tokyo, the demands of people around you are very high. The exigence is extreme. And so you get better in a culture like that.
We could talk a lot more about football, but I want to move on to one of the more Freudian parts of your book, where maybe accidentally Freudian, where you say you realized at a certain point, especially after having kids in France, that you had replicated your own childhood because you used to be embarrassed of your parents speaking bad Dutch and not knowing the social codes, and now our children are ashamed of us and our French.
Yeah, probably many of you know this experience. I read once a teacher saying that's the tragedy of an immigrant family, is that the child surpasses the parent too early. And so that can reach the level of, you know, you live in a Chinese-speaking family in Los Angeles and your parents can't speak English or write English, so you deal with the doctor and you file their taxes from the age of 12. And it takes all sorts of forms. With us, it's more benign, but they tell us how Parisians behave. So when our kids started primary school, you sometimes have to write a note to the teacher, and I would sign it, Simon. And Lila, our daughter, said, "You cannot do this. This is inappropriately informal." Whereas at a British school, you would definitely sign with your first name. At a Dutch school as well. But in France, that is, it's just a huge code breaker. So I get that a lot. And they also, because they're between cultures, they understand different cultures, they can also read these things.
Yeah. You had told this great story when you were, this is a little bit back into the footballing, but it's about parenting too, that you were in the car with some French friends bringing all of our boys to a match. And the boys were talking about how they were one day going to be great footballers. And one of the dads turned around and sort of set them straight. Can you tell that?
Yes, we're driving to this tournament in Limoges. The kids are about 8. There's about 7 of them in the back seat. And they're talking about, stardom and football. And our Portuguese friend, Eduardo, turns around and he says, "Boys, you know none of you is ever going to become a professional footballer, right?"
It was the opposite of the American Dream speech, where you can be whatever you want to be.
And these 8-year-old boys were stunned. The thought had never occurred to them that they would not become professional footballers. And from Eduardo, I've also learned a lot because he is from the Portuguese banlieue. So in his family story, his grandparents walked into France barefoot. Portugal, fascist regime, poorest country in Europe. 500,000 Portuguese came to the Paris region. He once said to us, remember when we were all talking about our origins, he said, "You won't see any Portuguese people in the French elite." And it hadn't occurred to me, but I think that's largely correct. And he thinks, like many people, he became middle class through the République, through education, through university. And he's terrified at the thought that his children might not see that route. And the football dream is also very overpowering in Paris because so many people, if you're a kid, if you're a boy who's interested in football, do our scouts are by professional clubs, so it's not a dream. It's really quite close. Yeah. And that makes it more dangerous. Yeah.
You're the Plouk who came to Paris and finally actually became French in the wake of Brexit.
Legally, yes. Yeah.
You were, I did not know this ahead of time, or I would have been very nervous, but you were taken in for questioning during your naturalization process.
I did tell you, you probably weren't listening. I was called to the Interior Ministry, and I was taken to taken to the basement, where a lot of the rooms are marked, terrorist cell, sort of planning for terrorism. And they take me to this non-terrorist room, this man and this woman, and they're very excited because they've realized that I'm a spy. And they're pretty sure I'm a spy, but they don't know who I'm spying for. And so we have this long, quite polite interrogation. And at one point I say, look, you think I'm a spy? And they say, no, pas du tout. And then they keep... And at the end I say, their question is like, do you know diplomats? And I say, yeah, I'm a journalist. Can you give me all their names? So they get very, very excited. They're very excited when I said that I'd written a book about a spy. That was almost definite proof. And at the end, I say, look, I can see you think I'm a spy. It's very hard for me to deny that I am because everyone when asked says, no, I'm not a spy. Of course they say that. Is this going to impede my naturalization process? And they said, no, not at all. There's nothing to do with it. And they were quite right because a few weeks later, I got a letter saying I was French. Yeah.
Wow. But you also wrote in the book that you actually were resentful because you'd never been recruited to be a spy.
Yeah, So I was at university in England, started in the 80s. My degree was history and German. I dedicated myself to learning good German, reading German literature, not knowing where I would end up. And German was key spying language of the 80s. Of course, they should have recruited me, but nobody ever asked because I wasn't posh enough. Is my analysis. Yeah.
So I'm an American in Paris and you're a Brit in Paris, and we're often lumped into the same kind of Anglophone bowl.
Anglo-Saxon. Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon. But in fact, I think it's a very different experience to be British here, partly because you often study French in school, where for us the sort of default foreign language is Spanish, and also because France is so close for you. You had been here on vacation many times with your family. Any middle-class family would have gone camping in the French countryside. What's it like? What's it like for you to be British in Paris, and how do you experience that?
Well, contrary to cliche, my sense is that the French admire the British and see us often as being a bit above the fray. So the distrust is usually applied to other French people and non-white immigrants. Those are the bad people. I mean, the late Christophe Deloire told me they don't trust anyone. He said they don't trust the rich, they don't trust the poor. They don't trust immigrants, they don't trust French people, which is all true. But strangely, British people have slightly escaped that. And there's still this kind of gentleman image and fair play and stuff, which French people, I find, tend to believe. There's also the Financial Times. So I say I'm a Financial Times journalist, and nobody here, no French person that I've met one. I've only met one French person who's ever knowingly read the Financial Times. But they say, oh, wow, that's a really good newspaper. Meaning that they have a vague sense that it's British and high status. And so I found that quite useful as well.
You wrote that after Brexit, when you would interview French officials, when they would mention Brexit, they would sort of like smirk with delight, as if they had won.
Yeah. So I said to one of them, you know what, if the French had held a referendum in 2016, I think they would have voted for Brexit. And he said, yes, but we would not have been so stupid as to hold that referendum.
Macron and France in general seem very determined to sort of seize the opportunity of Brexit to turn France into a banking center and an investment center. Do you think that has worked?
It's worked a little bit. So, JP Morgan, for example, they moved a lot of people to Paris, Bank of America as well. I think it was a JP Morgan guy told me, they then tried to recruit quants, so people who do data analysis. And they found, this is a country where the king subject in school is maths. And we're now seeing, if you want to join the French elite, the most important subject to do and to do it prépa is maths. And so there are a lot of quants in Paris. They earn less than quants in London, which is great. And so JP Morgan delighted. It's also becoming a city where it's becoming a business center where you can function in English. So a lot of these new bankers arriving from London and the US, they don't need to speak French. They don't care. They don't do it. And I think 10 or 20 years ago, that would have been much harder. But it's not very much. So Paris has got more of the banking than any other European city, partly because nobody wants to live in Frankfurt. But it's still not huge. And I think Paris also doesn't really want it to be huge. The weird thing that's happened in Paris the last 10 years is that it's become a luxury city in a way that it's never been before. And I don't think anyone in any city has ever been before. So the stat that really wowed me is, last I checked, 3 of the 5 biggest companies in Europe, biggest listed companies, are French luxury companies headquartered in Paris. So that's LVMH, Chanel, and Christian Dior, which I think is part of LVMH, but is also listed separately. That doesn't even include Kering, which is privately held. So what you see more and more is this has become the kind of the Premier League, the NBA of luxury. It's attracting people who work in luxury from all countries, all languages, and sort of the business of Paris is becoming luxury. And that, of course, is very sensitive in a city which also has a tradition of revolution.
Yeah. But one thing that strikes me in Paris's transformation into more of a financial center is that they're trying not to become London.
Yeah, the anxiety is becoming London. So it's also not, it's becoming more a luxury center than a financial center. And, you know, you can do finance somewhere else, but you can't make LVMH bags in China or in London, because what people want is the feel that it's in the descent from Louis XIV, where sort of French luxury has its origins. But yeah, they don't want to become a city of plutocrats. And so how do you do that? You build a lot of social housing and you buy up buildings and turn them into social housing. So already just inside the Périph', 25% or so of Parisian homes are social housing, and they're going to raise that to about 35%. And over these 68 new stations, they're going to build loads of housing, which a lot of which is going to be social housing. So you build a new station, you can build like an 8-story or a 10-story in the banlieue, very nice housing. People come downstairs, they're in the metro. Across the street from the metro, you do the same. So you could build quite easily 1.5 Parises just outside and around these new stations. So I think they're going to build enough housing and affordable housing to stop this becoming an unaffordable city the way that, because London can't build, New York is not good at building, they struggle to do that.
Some of the other changes that you've witnessed during your years in Paris have been more social and cultural. So you write about shorter lunches, less wine at lunch, more English, better coffee. I would argue that some of these are positive changes.
I like it all.
You know, and the French also have, you know, they have dating apps. They no longer read books on the metro. They stare at their phones the way we Anglo-Saxons do. You write that even in Paris, time has become money. I mean, has our culture of efficiency and busyness infected the French? Or is technology more powerful than culture?
Globalization is powerful, but I mean, France was a very particular alternative to kind of the Anglo-Saxon worldview. You saw that most spectacularly over the war in Iraq, where obviously the Russians and Chinese are going to respond to these events and have different ways of living than the Anglos. That's taken for granted. And there's very few people in the Western world who want to copy them. But France is a challenge because it's this alternative model within the Western world of how you can do things a bit differently. Like you have a bigger welfare state, you have longer holidays, you spend more time thinking about food. And so that's always been a bit of a challenge that the French are worried of losing, and I think they sustain it. So I read this very good economist, I think a Canadian, writing about the French attitude to work. And he said the pride is not in doing long hours or earning a lot of money. The pride is in a kind of artisanship. So your baker, your plumber, your writer, these people are the furniture repairer. These people are very proud of what they do. They consider themselves experts. They take it very seriously. And they also think that they should not work more than, say, 40 hours, and they should have August off, which I support and believe. So France has a very particular kind of work ethic, and I don't see the work ethic of the kind of New York thing of, let's meet for a working breakfast at 6:30 a.m. I don't really see that happening here, thank God. So I think it will maintain some level of difference. Globalization does erode national peculiarities a bit, often in good ways. It's made Parisians, I think, less rude, because this was probably the rudest city in the Western world, and now it's not really completely the rudest city in the Western world anymore.
Well, I know we covered a lot of territory, and there's a lot more territory in the book. Perhaps we should open the floor up to some questions.
If you have a question, please raise your hand high and we will bring you the microphone. Looks like one over there.
Hey, my name is Robert. I'm from Finland, but I feel very at home here, so thank you, Americans. And I'm curious, you talked about the relevance of France globally and with globalization, but what does the FT actually ask you to write about? And as a Parisian expert for a global newspaper, how do they view Paris, and what's relevant about that for the global elite who might read it?
Well, the FT has a bureau in Paris of 3 colleagues of mine, and I'm not that. So we have 3 people here who cover the politics, the economy, finance, and I don't. I write an international column from here, and obviously because I'm here, sometimes I'll write a piece about what's happening or things I feel about Paris. But I mean, I think the Financial Times, I've always been hugely grateful to them. It's been nearly 30 years now. They give me almost no direction. I think what they also want is the ideal for a newspaper is an easy journalist, an easy columnist, who's someone who tells you what they want to write. It fits. There's no crazy errors and delivers on time. And so they don't want to, with me, they don't have much management time. So they don't tell me what to write.
The main job certainly of a columnist, but of a journalist in general, is to come up with story ideas.
Yeah. I know Paris better than the people I'm reporting. My editors in London. I should be telling them what I think is interesting. So all the wrong decisions about what to cover are made by me.
Thank you.
I have a question. One of the chapters that you wrote, which I was very upset about because it's an upsetting issue, that of pedophilia. Do you see and how the attitudes are changing and perhaps the laws are changing in terms of the definition? Yeah. Do you see this latest case with the woman with the alleged 59 rapist as being the culmination when someone's willing to come forward? Do you see that as kind of pushing the wave forward away from the way it was that you wrote about?
I mean, I think Me Too took a different form in France, but obviously Me Too is inspired from the US from 2017. And you get a lot of pushback, including from elder French women like Catherine Deneuve, who say, no, all this is just censoring men and it's part of the beautiful game between men and women, that men should be allowed to kind of essentially assault women. And so Me Too, that version of Me Too, the American version of Me Too, hit resistance in France. It did make some headway. So in the parliament now, there are signs on the lift doors saying sexual harassment is illegal, and if it happens to you, this is a number you can call, because parliament was a place where a lot of that happened, the Assemblée Nationale. So it did make some headway, but not that much. And then the big breakthrough in France, oddly, was, as you say, around incest and pedophilia. So there were these 2 memoirs, very important, by women published around 2020-21. Camille Kouchner, who's the daughter of Bernard Kouchner, and Vanessa Springora, who writes about age 14, her relationship with the author Gabriel Matzneff, and how pedophilia...
He was 50.
He was even older. Pedophilia was supported in the post-68 environment. You got leading intellectuals like Sartre and de Beauvoir saying, well, 1968 is about sexual liberation. Everyone should be allowed to, flower sexually. And then in the 70s, people start to say, and that should apply to children as well. They should also, flower sexually, and they should be encouraged by adults who know how it works. And so that backlash came in 2020-21, the kind of women of about 40 pushing back at the 68 generation. So it's a generational conflict, and that was very powerful. The law on age of consent changed. I think before it was legal age of consent in France was 12. So a 12-year-old could, something like that, could consent to sex with an adult legally. And that was finally changed. The Assemblée Nationale previously refused to change that about 3 years before. So that's big. And now with this rape case, I think that's another it's a different step in Me Too, because it's obviously not about pedophilia, but it's another French moment where you get, because all these things conservatives can just dismiss as, but that's le wokisme, and all these are just American problems. So anyone saying, oh, well, there's a problem with sexual aggression, they say, oh, well, these are just American, you're just adopting American language, and in France, it's different, we're more sophisticated, and you're doing le wokisme, which is a huge insult. And I think the Bellico case has made it much harder to just say, oh, well, let's talk about sexual aggression. Is this wokeism? So I think these things go from being a struggle to the struggle winning.
I want to bring the subject back to football real quickly and ask you a question about football here, particularly in Paris, and contrast it perhaps with another city. How do Parisians relate to Paris Saint-Germain, given its foreign ownership, given the Qatari connection, given all of the money that's involved? And could you contrast that with how in Marseille people feel about Olympique Marseille? And then just real quickly, another question. Do you ever think that women's football will break through in France the way it has in the United States?
Okay, so I think Paris Saint-Germain is as wrongly maligned as a plastic club. So I know a lot of Parisians my age and also our kids, but Parisians my age who grew up with Paris as a terrible club, but they really supported it. So it was similar to OM. It was a big city club. Most of the people in the stands were from the banlieue. And so you get a lot of people. It's only created in 1970. It's about the newest big club in Europe. It's created by the couturier Daniel Echter. And but still, people really loved it, and it was part of Paris' belonging identity, and especially banlieusard identity. And then it becomes suddenly very good, and they get rid of all the hooligans. So when I started going 20 years ago, you had literally a white stand, often of skinheads, one of whom tried to assassinate Jacques Chirac, and then opposite a non-white stand. And because there are no foreign fans and no traveling fans in French soccer, because most of the teams are village teams, the two stands would fight and insult each other during the game. It was very bizarre. So I think Paris is a real club, and it's become bigger now. And I don't think it's fair to suggest it's just a Qatari invention. Qatar obviously changed it a lot. As for women's football, I mean, I've been to Paris Saint-Germain women's matches with 40,000, 45,000 people in the stadium. I definitely think that women's football, you see it with the national team when they played, I think, the World Cup 2019, their viewing figures nationally, television, in the first round were the same as for the men's World Cup, the French men's team a year earlier. So I think totally this is going to become, I mean, because France, like many other countries, banned women's football between about 1920 and 1970. So there's an enormous gap to catch up. And it was banned partly because the men saw that it was becoming popular at the end of World War I. But I think that it will make up a lot of that gap.
Our daughter was a sort of groundbreaker in
yeah, she was
French
at that time the only girl in the club and suffered tremendous sexism and exclusion.
Yeah. Also, she wasn't very good at football, so it was.
Which made it all the braver that she continued as a kind of feminist statement for years. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you both for the discussion. I came across a cartoon by Sempe recently, and the caption was "On s'américanisait de plus en plus," and he died a few years ago, so I have no idea when this appeared, but it could be 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, I think, was such a caption. And the irony of it was that the illustration showed two little characters. One was holding a small dog. The other one had a baguette under his arm. In other words, they were very typiquement French, okay? And so it seemed to me that the cartoon was representing a kind of resistance in French culture to change. Your book is about change. I wonder what you think about the role of resistance to change in French culture.
I think the French feel we've got something here. We got something quite special, the way we eat, the way we live. The work-life balance, which is better than elsewhere, and they're afraid of losing it. So I think the resistance to change to some degree is logical. The anti-Americanism, I mean, I wonder if there were elements before 1944, but probably consistently since 1944, you could have drawn that cartoon, it would have been true. On the other hand, there's a lot of love. So Au bout du souffle, Godard's first film, about 1960, is, the main character loves America. He dresses like an American gangster. He steals American cars. So it's a complex relationship. But also the US dominated the West in those decades in a way it doesn't now. So the influences are from K-pop or from some weird Swedish YouTuber, as well as just from the US now.
Hi, I wonder, in light of the upcoming American election, if you could speak about Franco-American relations over the next 4 years, if it's a Harris administration versus a Trump administration, and what we should think about from here.
Well, France for 50 years has been saying Europe should run its own foreign policy without the US. And all the other leading European countries hate that because the UK is like, but we're the vassal. We're the kind of European fixer of the US. The Germans had always taken the view we don't want to have a foreign policy. And the Eastern Europeans, after they got liberated, they said to France, are you fucking crazy? Are you going to come in and send troops? It's only going to be the US. So this was a deeply unpopular position. And Trump has made this ancient French idea suddenly viable because Trump would abandon us immediately. And so this is something that the French policy establishment thinks about day and night, because the terrible thing is when your dream comes true. So if Trump wins, we may well have an independent European foreign policy and defense policy for the first time, and nobody is ready for it. I think they hope that if it's Harris, then, same old with a little bit. I mean, Europeans are massively upping their defense spending, but I went to see the French Army Ministry and they said, we would hope that in a few years we could get a battalion together that could send, a few thousand people, a few thousand armed soldiers to fight in the Baltics. And, if you know that Russia has already lost something like 500,000 soldiers, I think the Russians will take the view the Europeans are going to send a few people, we're going to kill some of them, and then the Europeans are going to give up, which I don't think is a completely mistaken attitude.
If I'm not mistaken, recently you moved your family to Spain briefly.
To Madrid for a year. It's much better than Paris, I can say that objectively.
What did you learn there, and what did you bring back?
I learned that it's lovely living in a city where there is sun in January, where people are friendly, where everything back then was 50% the cost of Paris, and that the nicest country to live in the Western world, if you have more than the average Spanish income, which I think is something like 15,000 euros. So if you're above 15,000 euros, it was then, just Spain is the best country in the world. Paris definitely isn't. But Paris is a global city. It's very, as you know, for journalists, it's a very exciting and useful city to be in, whereas nobody wants to read about Spain. I think it's what he's done. Yeah, I did call you. Yeah.
You need the mic.
You need a mic.
So following up on the foreign policy question, given that Macron is about to be term limited out, and given that he's the one that has this sort of grand vision of a European foreign policy, do you see anybody on the scene either in France or in Europe who can assume that mantle and create a united European foreign policy?
Well, Macron has been totally unable to create it, because whenever Macron stands up and talks about this stuff, everyone gets really angry. The Poles are, infuriated and disgusted by Macron, also because he was trying to keep Putin on board for the first. So he's a very good thinker. I always think he would be a good columnist, but he's a very poor diplomat. And partly because I think with Trump and with Putin, he had this over-reliance on seduction charm. I seduced and then stabbed all these older men like Hollande, and I can do it with Putin and Trump, but they have more of a will to power than people he previously encountered. So I actually think that, France doesn't produce presidents who lead by consent, because that's not what the French presidency is. And, especially now with the UK, a weakened country that's not in the European power structures, the French think, well, everyone should be listening to us. I just think that if Trump wins, then we are going to have an independent European foreign policy and military policy, and it's going to happen in a kind of ugly and inefficient way, but you won't need a visionary figure. It's just going to have to happen. And it may not be enough.
We have time for one more very quick, possibly non-political question. Yes. Yeah, could you give her the...
Thank you. My question was, what do you think were the big takeaways from the Olympics for Paris, and then for Paris, like outside of Paris? Like in France, what's the takeaway from the Olympics, and what's the takeaway about Paris for the rest of the world?
I think two things. When you go across town on a night like this, you're in a packed metro, it's raining, everybody's sulky. you get this tendency, which I think is a very Parisian one, to think this is the worst place in the world. This is horrible. I hate it here. My life is awful, which is, I think, the ambient Paris noise. And then when you see Paris through the eyes of others, so partly the opening ceremony and then, the whole world saying, oh my God, for 2 weeks, you think, okay, this is the best city in the world. And it has its problems in our lives. They have problems partly because we don't have any space, but we should appreciate it a lot more than we do. I think the other takeaway was the key message of the Olympics as given by the opening ceremony, the French cultural elite, but also the athletes themselves was France has beautiful diversity and Paris has beautiful diversity. If you look at the athletes, you look at the opening ceremony, which starts with 2 Arab men, Zinedine Zidane and Jamel Debbouze, the comedian. And Debbouze says to Zidane when he appears, Zizou Christi, he's Zizou and Zizou Christi, which is, for me, blasphemy right from the start. And 86% of French people, according to a poll, approved of the opening ceremony, which is like one long advert for diversity. It's interesting that there is no politician in France who will make a positive argument for diversity in a way that in the UK would be, I think, much more normal and anodyne for a politician to do. You will never hear it here. You saw it there, and I think it could have some appeal.